The silence that settled over the hospital room wasn't just the absence of sound, but the kind of stillness that settles when endings are declared. A man pressed against the wall, his expensive suit now rumpled, hands clutching his mouth as if to stifle the unspoken. A senior doctor gestured toward the door, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Another nurse knelt, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if the tiles might offer answers the monitors couldn't. The baby had stopped breathing minutes ago, and every intervention had turned to ash in their throats. Then the door swung open. A boy slipped inside, unnoticed at first, 11 small, his gray shirt torn and stained, shoes caked in mud from 3 blocks of chasing an ambulance. He moved like someone accustomed to fading into shadows, to being unseen. He had followed the father running, a man in a suit whose frantic pace defied his polished exterior, and something deeper than sight had pulled him forward. Kyle didn't hesitate when he reached the sink. What followed in the next 60 seconds would live in that room, in the hospital's memory, in the stories they'd tell for years. If you believe that courage doesn't need an address and that kindness wears no uniform, then like this video, subscribe to WhatsApp Kindness Tailies, and share this with someone who needs to remember that people matter. Kyle had been 11, homeless for 8 months, bouncing between a church shelter that locked its doors at 7 and a makeshift haven under an overpass where he'd turned concrete and cardboard into a life. His backpack held 3 things: a pair of fresh socks, a photograph of his mother, and a worn book about the human body, its spine split from being read countless times. That book was a compass. He'd been captivated by medicine since 6, when his sister nearly died of an allergic reaction, and a paramedic's steady hands had brought her back. Without schools or libraries, he'd scavenged knowledge from donation bins and clinic shelves, teaching himself through pamphlets and dog-eared textbooks. The chapter on infant emergencies had become his gospel, its lessons etched into muscle memory. On the morning it mattered, he sat in a park 2 blocks from the hospital, nibbling a granola bar, watching the city wake. He noticed the running man first, suit, urgency, a bundle cradled against his chest. He stood, drawn by something he couldn't name. The hospital doors loomed 3 blocks away. By the time Kyle arrived, the man had vanished into the emergency wing. He slipped past a family, followed voices echoing down a corridor, and burst into the room just as the doctor delivered the verdict. 8-month-old Eli had inhaled fluid while left unattended in a bouncy seat, and 40 minutes of resuscitation had yielded nothing. Garrison Vale, the father, pressed against the wall, his face a map of a billion-dollar man undone by helplessness. Kyle crossed the room without a word, lifted the infant, and tilted his head into the sink stream of water, mimicking the book's instructions, head and neck supported, body angled to let gravity work its quiet magic. The physician pointed at him and barked. "What are you doing?" The nurse moved to intervene. Kyle didn't turn. "1 minute," he said, his voice steady as bedrock. Something in it, the absence of bravado, the certainty of someone who'd memorized 1,000 steps, halted the room. 40 seconds later, the baby coughed, then wailed, and chaos erupted. Monitors beeped back to life, doctors surged forward, the nurse sank to her knees, hand over her heart. Garrison slid down the wall, a sound escaping his throat that wasn't quite sobbing. Kyle placed the baby on the table, retrieved his backpack, and drifted toward the hallway just as Garrison called out, "Wait." This is where the story bends, where the visible moment meets the invisible hands that shaped it. The boy's survival wasn't just his doing. Years earlier, a volunteer named Dorothy had left a box of donated books outside a clinic, tossing them over her shoulder without thinking. Kyle found it at dawn, taking one book, a relic of forgotten knowledge. A retired paramedic named Harold held free first aid sessions at the shelter, letting anyone attend, no questions asked. Kyle came every second Sunday, absorbing lessons about airways and rescue positions. A shelter supervisor named Irene let him linger past closing, never nodding it, just keeping the door open until he was done. None of them were in that room, yet all of them were. Their quiet choices had paved the way for this moment. Garrison found Kyle in the hallway, his face streaked with tears, and asked where he lived. Kyle told him the truth. Garrison didn't flinch or offer pity. Instead, he asked, What do you want to do with your life? What do you need to do it? Their agreement wasn't charity. Garrison had spent decades investing in potential, and now, in a hospital corridor at 11, he'd found a boy whose mind was already brimming with it. Kyle enrolled in school within weeks, living with a foster family supported by Garrison's foundation, gaining access to tutors, a library card, and a winter coat. He kept the book, its pages now well thumbed. 4 years later, he excelled in science, attending a medical symposium at 14 as the youngest there, asking questions so precise they outshone the experts. Garrison's son, now 5, called him by a word that meant the one who stayed. The night before high school began, Kyle wrote letters to Dorothy, Harold, and Irene, thanking them for the threads they'd woven into his destiny. Dorothy wept for 20 minutes, then called her sister to read his words again. Harold replied on brittle, yellowed paper, finally seeing the path his lessons had taken. Irene never wrote back, but she framed Kyle's letter and hung it by the door she still left unlocked each morning. The story ends not with a lesson learned, but a truth lived. Never dismiss a person for where they sleep. Never assume silence means empty. Never mistake worn shoes for a small life. And never forget that the knowledge that saves a life might come from a box left on a pavement by someone who simply couldn't let books die. If this moved you, like the video, comment, and share it with someone who needs to believe in people today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, resilience, and the quiet decisions that change everything. Because kindness doesn't always come in white coats. Sometimes it arrives in a torn gray shirt carrying a book with a broken spine, and it stays when everyone else has stepped back. Welcome to Kindness Tales. We're so glad you're here.